The air in Arthur Hayes's 40th floor conference room was so thoroughly filtered and climate-controlled that it seemed to possess no character at all, much like the sleek, minimalist furniture. It was the kind of expensive neutrality that was supposed to be calming, but instead felt alienating. Maria Moretti felt a chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. It radiated from the pit of her stomach, a cold, dense star of grief. She sat in a buttery leather chair, the kind Frank would have inspected the stitching on, her black wool dress feeling heavy and suffocating. 3 days. It had only been 3 days since the world had lost its color, since the booming laugh of her husband had been silenced forever. Outside the panoramic window, the Chicago skyline stood indifferent, a collection of steel and glass monuments to ambitions that were not hers. Across the gleaming mahogany table, her son David and his wife Brenda sat like a pair of well-dressed vultures waiting for the eulogy to end. David, who had her dark hair but had inherited Frank's build, had his hands clasped on the table, a portrait of strained filial piety. Brenda, a woman who seemed to be assembled from a luxury catalog, wore a black dress that was just a little too fashionable for a funeral. Her perfume, a sharp floral scent, aggressively colonized the sterile air, an offense to Maria's muted senses. Brenda's manicured hand rested on Maria's arm, a proprietary gesture. "We're right here with you, Maria," she murmured, her voice a practiced, sympathetic hum. The touch was like ice. Arthur Hayes, a man whose face was a roadmap of 65 years of other people's troubles, adjusted the spectacles on his nose. He and Frank had been friends since they were young men with more dreams than dollars, and the grief in his eyes was genuine. "Maria," he began, his voice a low, comforting rumble that vibrated through the tabletop. "Frank made me promise I wouldn't draw this out," he said. "Arthur, when I'm gone, Maria will have enough to deal with. Just get it done." A fresh pang of sorrow struck Maria. That was Frank to a T. Practical, protective, always thinking of her. She remembered his hands, calloused and strong, capable of wrestling a 2x4 into place or being impossibly gentle as he fixed her necklace clasp. The memory was so vivid she could almost feel his warmth. She gave a numb, tiny nod. Arthur began reading the legal boilerplate, a river of jargon that flowed past Maria's ears. She focused on David's reflection in the polished table, watching the subtle impatience in the tapping of his finger. He thought she didn't notice. Brenda was perfectly still, a statue of supportive grace. But Maria saw the tightness around her eyes, the hunger. Finally, Arthur arrived at the heart of the matter. "And the controlling interest in Moretti Builders," he read, his voice gaining a solemn weight, "along with all associated assets, properties, and accounts, I leave solely and entirely to my beloved wife, Maria Moretti." The silence that followed was immense, a vacuum that sucked all the air from the room. It was not just an inheritance. It was the sum of Frank's life, the brick-and-mortar manifestation of his soul. It was 50 years of sweat, risk, and integrity. She felt the crushing weight of it settle on her shoulders. She risked a glance at her son. For one unguarded second she saw it clearly, not just disappointment but a flash of pure, unadulterated fury. It was a dark, ugly thing that twisted his features before he wrestled it back under control, replacing it with a mask of dutiful acceptance. Brenda's smile became a bloodless, razor-thin line. Acceptance. "Well, of course," David said, his voice a fraction too loud. "That's exactly what Dad would have wanted. We're here for you, Mom. 100%. You won't have to lift a finger." He reached across the vast table, his hand covering hers. It was clammy and cold. "Brenda and I can handle the day-to-day at the company. We'll consult with you on the big things, naturally, but you just need to focus on healing." The word healing was a cage, a soft-walled room they were already building around her. As Arthur concluded the formalities, a new and terrible premonition began to bloom in the pit of her stomach. She was trying to mourn her husband, but she realized, with a sickening lurch, that she might also have to mourn her son. The help began the very next day. David and Brenda descended upon the house not as family, but as an occupying force armed with casseroles and concern. "We just can't bear the thought of you rattling around in this big house all alone, Mom," David would say, taking off his jacket as if he owned the place. Brenda would sweep into the kitchen, her voice a constant, chirping commentary on how things ought to be. "Oh, Maria, this pantry needs a good clear out. Let me help you with that. We'll get everything organized." Their concern was a smothering blanket, leaving no air to breathe, no space for authentic grief. The sabotage was subtle at first, designed to be deniable, to chip away at the foundations of her reality. The first major incident was with her car keys. She was due at her sister's house, and she knew she had left them on the hook by the door, just as she had for 30 years. After 10 minutes of increasingly frantic searching, her panic rising, David found them. "Here they are, Mom," he called out from the kitchen. "In the sugar bowl. Oh, you poor thing. Your mind is just everywhere right now. It's completely understandable." Maria stared at the keys, coated in a fine white powder. She felt a flicker of hot anger. She had not put her keys in the sugar bowl, but to argue would make her sound defensive, irrational. It would make her sound confused. So she said nothing. A few days later, it was the quarterly tax file for Moretti Builders. Frank had always kept the active files in the top right drawer of the den desk. Maria went to retrieve it, planning to review it, to feel some connection to Frank's work. The drawer was empty. She searched the entire office, a cold dread creeping up her spine. The next morning, Brenda found it. "Here it is, silly," she chirped, pulling it from behind a cushion on the living room sofa. "You must have brought it out here to read and it just slipped down. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it." The condescension was breathtaking. The campaign of isolation intensified. Her sister Clara called, and Brenda answered the phone. Maria heard her say in a hushed, conspiratorial tone, "She's just resting now, Clara. The doctor said she needs her rest. I'll be sure to tell her you called." When Brenda hung up, she turned to Maria with a bright, false smile. "Just another one of those darn telemarketers, Maria. We don't want them bothering you." The lie was so bald-faced, so audacious, it left Maria speechless. They were actively cutting her off from her support system, curating her reality. They bought her groceries she didn't like, citing new health concerns, and then told visiting neighbors that they were worried because Mom's just not eating. Maria began to feel like a ghost in her own life. She started a journal secretly, noting down the strange occurrences, the misplaced items, the lies. She needed an anchor to prove she wasn't imagining it. She would look at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and wonder if the weary, haunted woman looking back was truly her. Was this what profound grief did to a person? Did it fray the edges of your mind until you couldn't trust your own memory? David and Brenda's narrative was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their constant suggestions of her fragility were making her fragile. Their quiet, pitying looks were making her question everything. The house was no longer a home. It was a stage set for her own unraveling. The suggestion came from Brenda, delivered with the precision of a surgeon making a careful incision. She found Maria sitting in the sunroom, staring blankly at the garden Frank had so lovingly tended. Brenda sat beside her, her expression a masterclass in worried affection. "Maria, honey," she began, her voice soft and low. "David and we've been talking. We're so worried about the toll this is taking on you. The stress, the sleepless nights. It's not healthy." She took Maria's hand in both of hers. "I took the liberty of making an appointment for you with a wonderful doctor, a Dr. Albright. He specializes in geriatric wellness. It's just a checkup to make sure you're getting the support you need." It was presented as a non-negotiable act of love. Maria, exhausted from the constant psychological pressure, too tired to argue, felt a wave of fatalism wash over her. "Fine, Brenda," she whispered, "if it will make you feel better." What Maria didn't see was the 15-minute phone call David had placed to Dr. Albright's office the day before. Leaning against the granite countertop in his own gleaming kitchen, miles away, David had spun a tale of heartbreaking decline. "Doctor, my name is David Moretti. I'm calling about my mother, Maria," he'd said, his voice thick with practiced sorrow. "Since my father passed, it's like a switch has been flipped. She was always so sharp. Now, she's forgetting things constantly. She's paranoid. She accused my wife of stealing from her. We're terrified she's going to hurt herself. There's a history of dementia in the family," he lied, adding a layer of genetic inevitability. We just need a professional opinion. We need help. The doctor's office was a symphony in beige and brushed steel. Dr. Albright entered the room with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. His questions, filtered through the lens of David's deceitful phone call, were not diagnostic. They were accusatory. "So, Maria," he began, tapping on a tablet, "your son tells me you've been experiencing some significant memory challenges, losing track of important papers?" Maria tried to explain the context, the stress, the feeling of being crowded in her own home. "I've been under a great deal of stress since my husband—" He cut her off with an understanding nod that wasn't understanding at all. "Grief can certainly accelerate underlying conditions. Tell me, have you been feeling suspicious of others? Believing people are acting against your best interests?" The question was a perfect double bind. She was trapped. She tried to regain control, to project competence. "Doctor, I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. I'm still processing the loss of my husband, but my mind is clear. I have plans for the company, for—" He just smiled that placating smile again. "Of course you do. It's important to feel a sense of purpose." It was the verbal equivalent of patting her on the head. The appointment, a brisk 15 minutes, concluded with him scribbling on a prescription pad. "This is a mild sedative, Maria. Lorazepam. It will help with the anxiety and the agitation your family is so concerned about. We need to get you rested." Walking out into the harsh afternoon sun, the prescription slip felt like a brand in her hand. It was a weapon they had commissioned, a piece of paper that officially labeled her as unstable. It was objective, medical proof to support their story. She got into her car and sat for a long moment, the sterile paper trembling in her fingers. She didn't feel sick, she felt hunted. With a surge of furious clarity, she crumpled the prescription and threw it onto the passenger seat. They would not drug her into submission. They had overplayed their hand. The fear was still there, but now it had a new companion: rage. The main house had become a hostile territory, every surface contaminated with Brenda's lemon-scented polish and David's suffocating solicitude. Their presence lingered even when they were gone, a film of deceit over everything Maria had once loved. To escape, she found herself drawn to the one place they never ventured: Frank's workshop. It stood at the back of the property, a simple, sturdy structure that was the complete antithesis of the main house. Pushing open the heavy wooden door was like stepping back in time, into a space that was wholly and authentically Frank. The air was rich with the holy trinity of his hobbies: the sharp, clean scent of cut pine, the metallic tang of machine oil, and the faint, sweet smell of varnish. It was a cathedral of competence. His tools hung on a vast pegboard, each hammer, wrench, and screwdriver nestled in its own black marker outline. A massive table saw stood silent in the center of the room. On his workbench, a half-finished rocking horse, its wood smooth and pale, waited for a final sanding, a project he'd started for a future that was stolen from him. The sight brought a familiar, piercing grief, but here it felt pure, unmixed with the poison of suspicion. This was Frank's sanctuary, and now it would be hers. She began to clean, a methodical, meditative act. She wasn't tidying, she was communing. She ran a soft cloth over the drill press, her fingers tracing the contours of the cold steel. She swept the floor, the rhythmic scrape of the bristles on the concrete a soothing mantra. This was real. The sawdust was real. The scent of wood was real. It was an anchor in the churning sea of their lies. As she worked her way to the far corner, near the old roll-top desk where Frank did his sketches, she tripped, stumbling forward. Her hand shot out to brace herself, landing hard on the floorboards. As she pushed herself up, she felt it. A slight give, a hollow echo beneath her palm that was different from the solid concrete she felt everywhere else. Her breath caught. Frank was a meticulous craftsman. A loose floorboard in his own workshop was like a typo in the Bible. It was wrong. It was intentional. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Kneeling down, her old knees complaining, she examined the board. The seam was almost invisible, but now that she knew it was there, she could see it clearly. She looked around the workbench, and her eyes landed on a sturdy putty knife. With trembling fingers, She slid the thin blade into the crack and gently pried. The wood resisted, then groaned, the sound loud in the quiet workshop. It lifted free, revealing not the dusty subfloor she expected, but a neatly cut cavity. Inside the dark space, something was wrapped in thick plastic. It was a small, rectangular object, and next to it lay a folded, yellowed piece of notebook paper. A jolt, electric and potent, shot through her. It was a feeling she hadn't had in weeks. Hope. Clutching the plastic-wrapped bundle to her chest, Maria moved with a furtive urgency she hadn't felt since she was a teenager sneaking out of her parents' house. She scanned the yard, ensuring David and Brenda's car wasn't in the driveway, before slipping back into the main house. She bypassed the modern home office Brenda had organized for her and went straight to the den, Frank's den. The room was untouched, smelling faintly of his pipe tobacco and old books. His heavy oak desk and worn leather chair were just as he'd left them. It felt safe. It felt like him. With hands that shook so badly she could barely work the zipper, she opened the dust-proof bag. Inside was a silver USB stick and the folded note. She opened the paper first. Frank's familiar strong handwriting, slightly slanted, filled the page. "For my Maria," it read. "If you found this, it means the worst has happened. Trust what's on the stick. Trust your gut. I love you always. F." The simple message was a gut punch. A sob escaped her lips, hot and painful. He had known. He had worried about this. He had tried to protect her, even from beyond the grave. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she turned on the old desktop computer. The machine whirred to life with a comforting, familiar hum. She slid the USB stick into the port. A drive icon appeared instantly. She clicked it, and a single folder materialized on the screen. Inside that folder was one video file, named with stark simplicity, "For Maria." Her finger hovered over the mouse for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she clicked. The screen flickered, and then he was there. Frank. Not a photograph, but him, moving and breathing. He was in his workshop, the backdrop of tools a familiar sight. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes etched deeper than she remembered, but his gaze was locked on the camera lens, intense and loving. "Maria," he began, and the sound of his voice, so real and so close, broke her heart all over again. "My love, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and it probably means you're in trouble from the one person I hoped I could trust to look after you." He paused, swallowing hard. "There's something I have to tell you, a secret I kept to protect our family, to protect David's future. I see now that was a mistake. My first duty was always to protect you." He detailed the entire sordid story. The accounting error 5 years prior, the quiet hiring of a forensic accountant, the gut-wrenching discovery. "It was David," Frank said, his voice laced with a father's pain. "He siphoned off nearly $100,000, funneled it through shell accounts. He had gotten in deep with online gambling, owed money to people you don't want to owe money to." Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, the pieces of David and Brenda's desperate, grasping behavior clicking into place. "I confronted him," Frank continued. "He fell apart, cried, begged me not to tell you, not to call the police. He swore it was a one-time thing, that he was ashamed. So I made a father's choice, maybe not a good businessman's choice. I covered the loss from my personal savings and forced him into a repayment contract. I thought the shame would fix him, but I was always afraid that the greed was still in there, waiting, especially with Brenda, who always saw this family as a bank account." He leaned in, his eyes pleading with the camera, with her. "This drive has everything. The accountant's report, the bank transfers, and a confession I made him write and sign. It's your insurance policy, Maria. Don't let him take what we built. Don't let him take you. I am so sorry I burdened you with this. I love you." The video ended. Maria sat frozen, staring at her own tear-streaked face reflected in the black screen. The woman staring back was no longer a grieving widow. She was a warrior who had just been handed a sword. The immediate, overwhelming wave of grief that the video had unleashed slowly receded, and in its place, something else began to crystallize. It was a feeling as cold and hard as granite. The sorrow was still there, a permanent fixture in the architecture of her soul, but it was now the foundation for a new structure, a fortress of resolve. Frank's final act had not been to burden her, but to arm her. The insidious whispers, the misplaced items, the feigned concern, it all snapped into a sickeningly clear picture. This wasn't a spontaneous power grab born of opportunity. It was the inevitable, festering conclusion of a long-hidden sickness of character. Her son, her only child, was not just greedy. He was a thief and a liar, and he was now trying to pathologize her, to strip her of her agency and her identity, all to get his hands on the money he felt he was owed. She spent the next hour meticulously clicking through the other files on the USB drive. It was all there, organized with Frank's typical precision. The forensic accountant's report was a cold clinical dissection of David's betrayal, complete with dates and account numbers. The scanned bank statements showed the money leaving Moretti Builders and reappearing in accounts linked to online betting sites. And then there was the confession. 2 pages of David's own handwriting, detailing his actions, his shame, his promises to repay every cent. Seeing his familiar looping signature at the bottom of that document made her feel physically ill. This was irrefutable. A plan began to form in her mind, not a plan of vengeance, but of justice. A direct confrontation would be a mistake. They would call it a paranoid outburst, another symptom of her decline. They would twist it against her. No, she would let them walk further into their own trap. She would use the persona they had so carefully constructed for her as a weapon against them. That evening, when they arrived with a pot of bland chicken soup, she was the masterpiece of their creation. She was distant, frail, her eyes seemingly unfocused. She forgot the name of their neighbor. She asked David twice about his day. She played the part of the confused, grieving widow so convincingly that she saw them exchange a look of ultimate triumph. When Brenda gently reminded her of the important family meeting with Arthur Hayes scheduled for the next day, Maria looked up with wide, vacant eyes. "A meeting? Oh my, I don't remember that at all," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "Are you sure?" David stepped forward and put a hand on her shoulder. "Positive, Mom," he said, his voice dripping with condescending reassurance. "But don't you worry about a thing. It's just a formality, to help take the load off your shoulders. We're going to take care of everything for you." Maria looked down at her hands, hiding the glint of steel in her eyes. "If you think that's what's best, dear," she murmured. Inside, her heart was a cold, steady drum. She would let them have their meeting. She would let them stand before their father's oldest friend and deliver their practiced lies. She would let them build their cage around her, right up until the moment she revealed that she was the one holding the key. The conference room was just as she remembered, a tomb of polished wood and silent judgment. Maria sat in the same chair, a lone island in a sea of leather and mahogany. She felt David and Brenda's eyes on her, their gazes a mixture of pity and predatory anticipation. They believed this was the final act, the gentle, legal euthanizing of her authority. Arthur Hayes, looking weary and sad, sat at the head of the table. He was Frank's friend, and his heart clearly ached for the woman he believed Maria had become, a fragile shell, lost in a fog of grief. "Thank you all for being here," David began, assuming the role of master of ceremonies. He sounded like a doctor about to deliver a grave diagnosis. "Maria, Mom, we are doing this because we love you. This is an intervention, and it comes from a place of deep, deep concern." Brenda, ever the organized partner in crime, slid a pristine file folder to the center of the table. "Arthur," she said, her voice modulated to project both competence and compassion. "As we've discussed, David and I have become increasingly alarmed by Maria's state since Frank's death. Her grief is of course understandable, but it has manifested in ways that put her, and the company, at significant risk." She opened the folder with the air of a prosecutor presenting Exhibit A. First, a signed letter from Dr. Albright, her new physician, Brenda stated, pushing the document toward Arthur. He notes his professional concern regarding her disoriented mental state, severe memory deficits, and incidents of paranoia. He strongly advises that she be relieved of all fiduciary and executive responsibilities. Arthur picked up the fiduciary and letter, his heavy sigh filling the room as he read the damning medical opinion. Next, David produced a neatly typed document. "And this is a log we've been forced to keep," he said, his voice catching with feigned emotion. Just a few examples of the daily lapses. Misplacing critical financial documents for the company, forgetting to turn off the stove, accusing us of stealing her mail. Just this morning, she seemed to have no recollection that this meeting was even happening. He let that lie settle. A capstone on the monument to her incompetence he had so carefully built. He turned to his mother, his eyes shining with unshed crocodile tears. "Mom, we love you more than anything. But you cannot run this company, it's too much. It would destroy you, and it would tarnish everything Dad worked his whole life to build." He slid a thick sheaf of papers toward the lawyer. "We've had these drawn up. A durable power of attorney and a formal request to the board to install me as acting CEO. It's the only responsible path forward." Arthur Hayes looked at the documents, then at Maria's passive blank face. The case seemed airtight. He cleared his throat, his expression sorrowful, preparing to explain the legal process, to gently guide her toward abdication. The room was silent. The trap, they believed, had snapped shut. Just as Arthur Hayes formed the first words of his gentle legal pronouncement, Maria raised her hand, a simple, elegant gesture that cut through the thick tension like a knife. "Before you speak, Arthur," she said, and the strength and clarity in her voice was so unexpected that it made both David and Brenda flinch. "There is something else you need to consider. A final piece of business my husband left for me." The pity on David's face curdled into confusion. Brenda's smug certainty faltered. What could she possibly have? With calm, deliberate movements that belied none of the fragility she had been performing, Maria reached into her large black purse and retrieved her laptop. She placed it on the table with a soft, definitive click. The sound seemed to echo in the silent room. She opened the lid, inserted the silver USB stick, and with a few taps of the keys, a video file was queued. She didn't look at the screen. She angled the laptop so that it faced her son, her daughter-in-law, and their lawyer. Frank Moretti's face filled the screen. For a moment, everyone was too stunned to react, staring at the ghost at the table. Then his voice, saturated with sorrow and resolution, filled the room. "My love, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and it probably means you're in trouble." The blood drained from David's face, leaving it a sickly, waxy gray. Brenda's jaw went slack, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looking garish on her pale, shocked face. They were paralyzed, watching their carefully constructed world get demolished, brick by brick, by the man they thought they had safely buried. Frank's recorded testimony was relentless. He detailed the embezzlement, the gambling, the quiet shame of the confrontation. He spoke of the secret repayment plan, the hope he'd had for his son's redemption. Then, Frank's face on the screen seemed to glare at his son as scanned documents flashed into view, the damning report from the forensic accountant, the undeniable bank statements tracing the flow of stolen money, and finally, the handwritten confession, David's own signature a damning indictment at the bottom. David began to shake, a low guttural sound of despair escaping his lips. Brenda stared at her husband, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror, not of being caught, but of having tethered her future to this weak, pathetic man. When the video finally faded to black, the silence it left behind was heavier and more damning than any accusation. Maria finally turned her gaze from the laptop and fixed it on her son. There was no fire in her eyes, no theatrical rage. There was only the cold, dead weight of truth. "Your father," she said, her voice low and steady, "gave you a chance to be a better man. You took that chance and you threw it away to try and convince the world that his wife, your mother, was crazy." She then turned her gaze to Brenda. "And you cheered him on." Arthur Hayes sat ramrod straight in his chair, his face a thunderous mask of fury and betrayal. The pity was gone, replaced by the righteous anger of a man whose oldest friend had been doubly betrayed. He didn't speak to David or Brenda. He simply reached for his desk phone, his movements precise and angry. "Yes, Helen," he said to his assistant. "Get me the district attorney's office, and then find me the best probate litigator in the state." David let out a choked sob and slumped in his chair, utterly broken. He hadn't been outsmarted by a failing mind. He had been destroyed by a father's love and a mother's strength. Maria stood up, her back straight, her ordeal over. The victory felt not triumphant, but somber and profound. She had saved Frank's legacy, but in doing so, had lost her son for good.